The mansion on the hill existed in a world of its own, separated from the city below by iron gates and unspoken rules. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished marble floors, walls lined with imported art, furniture that looked elegant but felt cold to the touch. Don Esteban Valmont liked it that way. Clean, quiet, controlled. Wealth had taught him that silence was power, and today, that power was wearing thin. He sat behind a massive desk, flipping through a stack of papers with growing irritation. The document was important, filled with legal terms and foreign phrasing that made his jaw tighten. German. He hated not understanding things, especially when they stood between him and more money. His usual translator wasn't answering calls, and the delay bruised his ego more than it should have. "Lucia," he called out, his voice sharp and impatient. From the hallway, Lucia appeared almost soundlessly. She had learned long ago how to move without being noticed in this house. Her uniform was simple, clean, perfectly pressed. Her hands bore the faint marks of work, but her posture was straight, composed. She had been cleaning the east wing when he summoned her, dust still clinging lightly to her sleeves. "Yes, sir," she said, keeping her eyes lowered out of habit. Valmont didn't look at her. He slid a sheet of paper across the desk as if it were a napkin. "Translate this," he said casually, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "It's German." Lucia hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes lifting to the page. Dense text, legal formatting, official seals, not simple at all. Valmont noticed the pause and smiled. It was the kind of smile he used when he sensed weakness. "What's wrong?" he asked, finally looking at her. "Too difficult." A couple of men seated near the fireplace laughed softly. Business partners, friends, he liked to call them, though they were really spectators to his power. Lucia swallowed. "It's a legal document," she said carefully. "That's the point," Valmont replied, leaning back in his chair. "Here's the deal. If you translate it correctly, I'll double your salary. If you can't, you'll clean the garage every day for a month. No help, no excuses." The laughter grew louder. The challenge hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. Lucia felt the familiar burn of being underestimated, a feeling she knew too well. She had felt it at border offices, at interviews, even here, every single day. She looked at the paper again, then at Valmont. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Valmont raised an eyebrow. "Afraid?" "No," she said softly. "Just asking." He waved a dismissive hand. "Go on, entertain us." Lucia took the paper into her hands. Her fingers were steady. As she looked at the first line, something shifted inside her. Not fear, not pride, but resolve. The room expected her to fail. She could feel it in the way the men leaned back, already amused, already convinced of the ending. She took a slow breath and began to read. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the words themselves carried weight beyond ink. Lucia scanned the first paragraph again, then lifted her eyes slightly, focusing on a blank space on the wall as she began to speak. Her voice was calm, measured, not rushed. She translated the opening lines carefully, choosing each word with precision. The legal tone shifted smoothly into Spanish, clear and structured. At first, Valmont listened with a crooked smile, convinced this was a lucky guess or a memorized phrase. But as the sentences continued, something changed. The smile thinned. His fingers stopped tapping the desk. Lucia moved into the second paragraph, explaining the intent behind a clause instead of merely translating it. She clarified a phrase that, taken literally, could mislead someone. Unfamiliar with German legal language, one of the men near the fireplace straightened in his seat. "Wait," he murmured. "That's not a common translation." Lucia nodded slightly, without looking at him. "Because it's not meant to be taken literally," she continued. "In this context, it refers to conditional ownership, not permanent transfer." The room grew quieter. Even the clock on the wall seemed louder now, each tick stretching the moment. Valmont leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes locked on the paper. Lucia continued, her confidence growing not from arrogance, but from familiarity. These were the kinds of documents she had studied for years, the kind that demanded patience and understanding rather than speed. She pointed out subtle grammatical structures that changed responsibility from one party to another, then explained how regional legal reforms had altered the interpretation of certain terms. One of the men stood up slowly and moved closer. She's explaining the framework, he said under his breath. Valmont shot him a warning look, but doubt had already crept in. He grabbed a pen and underlined a sentence. Translate that word again, he ordered. Lucia looked at it. It doesn't mean what you think it means, she said gently. In modern usage, especially in contracts after 2015, it implies temporary guardianship, not ownership. Valmont's jaw tightened. That's not what my translator said. Then your translator was wrong, Lucia replied, still calm. A sharp silence followed, the kind that makes people shift their weight, suddenly aware of the floor beneath them. She moved on to the next section, the one dense with conditions and footnotes. Her voice never wavered as she unraveled it line by line, turning complexity into clarity. She explained timelines, obligations, penalties hidden behind polite phrasing. She translated not just the words, but the intention behind them. As she reached the final page, she slowed down. This part, she said, pointing with one finger, is the most important. Valmont stood up abruptly. Enough, he snapped. You've said plenty. Lucia looked up at him for the first time fully. You asked for a translation, she said. This is part of it. Valmont hesitated. The men around him watched closely now, no longer amused, no longer relaxed. The balance of the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Read it, Valmont muttered. Lucia nodded and continued. She translated the final clause, explaining how a mismatch in dates and signatures invalidated the entire agreement. Her words landed slowly, like stones dropping into water. The ownership rights, she concluded, revert to the original partners if the annex is not synchronized with the main document. It isn't. For a moment, no one spoke. One of the partners stepped forward and took the paper from Valmont's hand, scanning it quickly. His face changed as he read. She's right, he said quietly. This clause nullifies the claim. Valmont's face flushed, then paled. He looked around the room, searching for support, but found only uneasy expressions. He turned back to Lucia. Where did you learn this? He demanded. Lucia lowered the paper and met his gaze. In Berlin, she said. I studied linguistics and legal translation. I earned my degree there. The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Valmont laughed sharply, but there was no humor in it. And yet you clean floors in my house. Yes, Lucia replied, because life doesn't always follow education. The men exchanged glances. The challenge that had begun as a joke now felt like a mistake. Valmont clenched his fists, his authority slipping through his fingers. You think this makes you special? He said bitterly. Lucia shook her head. No, it just means I understand what's written. The room was no longer his. Everyone knew it, including him. Valmont's laughter faded into something brittle, almost desperate. He paced behind the desk, running a hand through his hair, the expensive watch on his wrist catching the light as if mocking him. The men who had arrived confident and amused now stood in awkward silence, unsure where to place their eyes. The game had ended, and the result was undeniable. You've embarrassed me, Valmont said at last, his voice low. Lucia remained still. I answered what you asked, she replied. Nothing more. He stopped pacing and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as staff, not as background, but as a person who had slipped beyond his control. That realization unsettled him more than the document ever could. You could have said something earlier, he argued weakly. You could have warned me. Lucia gave a small, sad smile. You never asked what I knew. You only asked what I was worth. The words struck deeper than she intended. One of the partners cleared his throat and stepped back, already distancing himself from Valmont's growing humiliation. Another checked his phone, suddenly very busy. Valmont straightened his jacket, grasping at dignity. Fine, he said stiffly. You win. I'll double your salary, triple it, if you like. Stay. Lucia looked at the desk, at the paper, at the apron she was still wearing. Slowly, she untied it and folded it with care, as if every crease were deliberate. No, she said. The refusal stunned him. What do you mean, no? I mean I don't want your money, Lucia replied. I want respect, and that's not something you can offer me. She placed the folded apron on the desk beside the contract. The gesture was quiet, but it echoed louder than any shout. Valmont opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to threaten her with. Lucia turned and walked toward the door. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if she were leaving more than just a job behind. At the threshold, she paused and glanced back. "For what it's worth," she said calmly, "you might want to find a better translator." Then she left. The door closed softly, but the sound lingered. Valmont stood frozen, surrounded by wealth that suddenly felt hollow. The men avoided him now, their respect evaporated, replaced by quiet judgment. He sank into his chair, staring at the document that had started it all. For the first time in years, Don Esteban Valmont understood what it meant to be truly poor, not in money, but in humility.